Nepal grew back nearly half its forest, and almost nobody outside forestry circles has heard about it. Back in the 1970s, the World Bank made a grim call. Nepal's hill forests would vanish entirely, and instead, the country nearly doubled them. Here's how bad things looked before any of this turned around. Nepal nationalized its forests back in 1957, and that single decision stripped away the traditional local management structures that had kept things in check for generations. Government ownership replaced community control almost overnight, but resources to actually manage all that land never followed, and local incentive to protect it disappeared right along with it. Firewood, fodder, and farmland ate into some of the steepest permanently inhabited terrain on the planet, accelerating year after year. By the 1970s, researchers and global observers, the World Bank included, were predicting Nepal's accessible hill forests would vanish completely by the 1990s. Much of that alarm traced back to Eric Ekholm, whose 1976 book, Losing Ground, laid out what became known as the theory of Himalayan degradation, a crisis narrative that serious people believed at the time, and that later scholars pushed back hard against, arguing the whole catastrophe had been overstated from the start. Whatever the true scale of the original damage, one thing stayed constant. Nepal looked like a country on track to lose its forests for good. Everything changed in 1993, the year Nepal passed the Forestry Act, and that single piece of legislation reshaped what came next. Legal authority landed in the hands of what are called community forest user groups, letting them write their own constitutions, hold democratic elections, and take on real management rights over designated local forest areas. This kind of democratic self-governance over shared natural resources is exactly what Nobel laureate Elinor Ostrom spent her career arguing was possible. Her landmark research on commons management had shown that communities, given genuine authority and clear rules, could manage shared resources sustainably without either privatizing them or handing them to the state. Nepal's Forestry Act turned that theory into national policy. None of this was symbolic either. Nepal's own Department of Forests, administered through what's formally called the Ministry of Forests and Soil Conservation, identified 3.5 million hectares, 61% of state forest area, as eligible to hand over to these local groups, and people actually took up the offer. Nearly 2.3 million hectares of community forest exist today, about a third of Nepal's total forest, managed by more than 22,000 user groups representing 3 million households. Once local people got control of their own forests, what actually happened? NASA-funded researchers went back and checked using decades of Landsat satellite data, and the results were staggering. Forest cover climbed from 26% of Nepal's land area in 1992 to 45% by 2016, a figure that lands right at the edge of a full doubling, confirmed through the long-term satellite record paired with in-depth interviews conducted directly in Nepali villages. Here's the part that catches most people off guard, environmentalists included. Nepal didn't plant its way back to nearly half forested. Jefferson Fox, the principal investigator on the NASA-funded project, put it plainly. Once communities started actively managing their forests, the trees came back mainly through natural regeneration on their own. Tree planting only became necessary in lower elevation areas stripped almost completely bare. Up in the hills, the moment cutting stopped and grazing and fuelwood collection got restricted, the forest simply did what forests do when nobody interferes. It grew back on its own terms. One single community forest captures this entire national story in miniature. Devithan, a sacred grove east of a district called Kabrapalanchok, held just 12% forest cover back in 1988. By 2016, that same grove had climbed to 92%. What's remarkable is the timing. Devithan wasn't even formally recognized as an official community forest until the year 2000. Locals had organized informally right after the 1993 Act passed, restricting grazing and fuelwood collection entirely on their own initiative, years before any government paperwork caught up with what they'd already started doing. Researchers later found that roughly 25% of Devithan's total forest regeneration happened before rangers ever formally recognized the group. The community acted first. The forest answered back. The government simply noticed, eventually. Here's a mechanism almost nobody talks about, and it's a strange, uncomfortable piece of the puzzle. That same NASA-funded study found something unexpected. Households receiving remittance income from children who'd migrated abroad for work also showed a measurably positive effect on forest cover. The logic isn't complicated once you hear it laid out. Fewer people living on the land means less demand for firewood and fodder, which means less pressure on the forest overall. Part of the reason Nepal's forest came back is that people left. A separate, independent study looking specifically at privately managed land found this exact same pattern, with forest cover on private plots jumping from just 9% to 59%. Outmigration driving a real share of that gain. Nobody tells this story when they talk about Nepal's forestry success, and yet it's sitting right there in the data. A conservation win, powered in part by rural depopulation and families sending money home from somewhere else entirely. The forest came back, largely on its own, helped along by both community management and a countryside quietly emptying out. But recovery on this scale never comes free, and Nepal's version carries some real costs worth sitting with honestly. Start with inequality. Christer Andersen led a study published in Nature Sustainability in January 2026, digging into who actually benefited from Nepal's community forestry program. Equity sat at the center of the program's design from day one, with government guidelines requiring marginalized groups on executive committees and a defined share of forest income earmarked specifically for poverty alleviation. The data told a different story, though. Poverty dropped overall, and historically advantaged groups, Brahmin, Chetri, and Newar communities among them, clearly benefited. Marginalized Dalit and Janajati households saw something else entirely. Gaines Anderson himself called significantly smaller, and in some cases barely noticeable. One number here does the heaviest lifting. Local inequality widened by roughly 15%. Nobody actually got worse off. Anderson was careful to stress. Lower caste groups weren't harmed directly, in his own words, but they got left behind while everyone else moved forward. Researchers pointed to what they're calling a gatekeeper effect, where members of already dominant social groups navigate the bureaucratic hurdles of forest management more easily, letting them capture a disproportionate share of the benefits even when the rules on paper are meant to treat everyone the same. Then there's a genuinely strange economic paradox sitting right on top of all this new forest. Nepal covers 45% of its own land in trees and still imports significant amounts of wood and furniture every single year, with costs running into the billions of rupees depending on which year you check. Protection, not production, has driven almost the entire forestry model, and that's the core of the issue. High government royalty rates and taxes push the price of legally harvested Nepali timber above imported wood, so consumers reach for cheaper imports or substitute materials instead. This same economic bind is part of why Nepal's participation in REDD+, the UN's framework for reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, matters so much in policy circles. Carbon credit revenue could theoretically unlock economic value from standing forest that timber markets currently can't, though translating that promise into reliable income for community forest user groups has proven complicated in practice. Up close, the existing result looks genuinely absurd. Roughly 210,000 cubic feet of wood sits completely unused inside various forest offices across Nepal's Terai lowlands, the Madhesh province region, some of it decaying for over 2 decades now. Stacked, unsold timber doesn't even sit there safely either. A wildfire tore through the Gaindatar subdivision forest in Rowdahat district in April 2025, burning 22 piles of logs and 11 stacks of firewood that had simply been left there, unsold, caught in legal and bureaucratic processes that never resolved in time. One more honest complication deserves a place here, because leaving it out would make this story look tidier than it really is. A different research team, working from an entirely different satellite dataset and a different definition of forest cover, actually found Nepal lost tree cover overall between 2001 and 2016, roughly 33,800 hectares net, once new growth gets weighed against losses elsewhere. That sounds like a flat contradiction of everything covered so far, but look closer at what that same study actually found. Districts with more community forests posted the least tree cover loss of anywhere in the country, and districts with a higher share of community forest-covered land posted the greatest gains. Two completely different research teams, using different tools and different definitions, still landed on the same underlying conclusion. Wherever community forestry took hold, the trees held on, or came back. This disagreement was never really about whether community forestry works. It comes down to how you define and measure a forest in the first place, and that distinction matters more than pretending every study agrees down to the last hectare. So where does all this leave Nepal's forest story? Scholars who study forest transition theory, the framework that explains how and why countries shift from net deforestation to net reforestation, cite Nepal as one of the clearest and most studied cases on record. It's also the kind of outcome the UN had in mind when it embedded forest protection into Sustainable Development Goal 15, Life on Land. The idea that communities given real stakes in their local ecosystems will protect them in ways top-down management rarely achieves. A country told its hillside forests would vanish completely instead watched them nearly double, not primarily through government tree planting campaigns, but by handing real control back to the people who lived closest to the land, and in a twist nobody predicted, by some of those very same people leaving the land altogether. The forest that grew back is real, so is the inequality it quietly deepened, the timber rotting unsold while the country imports wood from abroad, and the genuine scientific disagreement over exactly how much forest actually came back. Nepal didn't just prove a collapsing forest can recover. It proved something more complicated and more useful. Recovery on this scale is never clean, and the honest version of a comeback story always runs messier and more interesting than the version that only counts the trees.